Alright, time for chapter 28. So chapter 28 is all on the female reproductive system, so doing the partner of the previous chapter. This one will be pretty short since we've covered a lot of the stuff from, like, for example, meiosis and a lot of the fetal development stuff, so this one might be a little bit shorter than the male chapter. So let's get started. Okay, so again, from fetal development, you have the gonadal ridges having both sets of duct systems for either the male or the female reproductive systems, and depending on the types of hormones that those systems are exposed to, whether or not it's going to develop as a male reproductive tract or the female reproductive tract. So for the female reproductive tract, it's due to the absence of testosterone and the Mullerian inhibiting factor, so MIF for short. Not because of the presence of a steroid, but because of the absence of a hormone. So both testosterone and Mullerian inhibiting factor are both considered androgen hormones. So androgen hormone is the umbrella term that describes both your testosterone and your Mullerian inhibiting factor. So the primary sex organ for your female reproductive tract are the ovaries. And they are the primary one because their job is to produce the sex cells. So in this case, producing the egg cells, also called the ova. Plural form of that is oocytes. So when your egg cells go through their own development, they're in their own fluid-filled vesicle that package them as they're developing, and then eventually they will ovulate or release that egg, and then even the vesicle itself actually will have a later function, which I'll describe later. So again, there's your term, your ovulation, which is the bursting of the follicles. That's the fluid-filled vesicle that your egg cell develops in, and then once that egg is then released, then that process is called ovulation. So this happens on a monthly calendar for females for the production of that egg cell and releasing it into the uterus for possible fertilization. Okay, here's a nice pretty cartoon version where you have your primary follicles that, again, packaged in their own vesicle for development and transport, eventually going to become a fully mature egg in this last picture here. Then once ovulation happens, so we have our oocyte or our egg cell that's released, this package then starts to degenerate. It first degenerates into a structure called the Corpus albicans. Corpus luteum. Sorry, that's the first one. Corpus luteum, which is this one here. So what that structure does is it secretes the progesterone and inhibin hormones. So during the monthly cycle of a female, the hormones actually fluctuate. So during ovulation, it's a strong estrogen signal. After ovulation, it's a strong progesterone signal. And if the oocyte is not fertilized, then the female will go through her monthly menstrual cycle where she sheds the functional layer of her uterus. And when this happens, the hormone levels are actually very stable. They're actually at the lowest that they are in the entire month. So both her estrogen and her progesterone levels are actually fairly low. So after a few days, the corpus luteum will continue to degenerate and become the corpus albicans. So it's kind of white looking. So the alba, kind of root word for white, in certain, I know it's definitely Spanish. That's the root for that one. So this scar tissue will eventually totally degenerate and just get reabsorbed into the ovary. Okay, moving on into the uterus. So in your uterus, you have 3 different layers, one of them being the muscular layer that will contract not only during labor contractions to expel the fetus out of the uterus, but also contractions during the monthly menstrual period to expel out the functional layer on, the endometrium, which is the inner lining of the uterus. So if the egg is not fertilized, this functional layer is actually shed off, and that's part of what gets discharged, and then the basal layer, which is underneath it, will remake a new functional layer every single month. Okay, moving on to the vagina and just focusing on the inner layer of the vagina, so your vaginal epithelium. So during development of the female, from going from an immature reproductive tract in a child to having those increase in different hormones and becoming more fully developed during puberty, the epithelial layer of the vaginal tissue actually undergoes a transformation. So this transformation is called metaplasia. So a nice little vocabulary word for you. So it goes from the simple cuboidal type of tissue, so one layer, kind of more square-like cells in a child, to after the estrogens will affect that tissue layer and it'll undergo metaplasia. And then that simple cuboidal tissue will be transformed into a stratified squamous, so stratified being multiple layers, squamous being that flat egg shaped type of cell. So this allows for essentially the vagina to be more resistant to the activity, either sexual or reproductive, now that the reproductive tract has become more mature and able to be actually able to carry a fetus. Also in the vagina, just other stuff I'm pointing out, so there's bacteria that's there that will ferment the glycogen there, which will cause an acidic pH. So if you remember from the last chapter where the sperm has to be protected from the acidic pH of the vagina, it's due to the bacteria fermenting the glycogen and causing that pH to be lowered and therefore causing an acidic environment in the vagina. So this acidic environment also inhibits the growth of pathogens, so helps to protect the vagina from outside exposure from things that can infect it. Last part about the vagina, so again, protecting this opening to the outside environment. You have these dendritic cells, so these immune system cells, which normally will just migrate throughout the epithelium, and once it comes across a pathogen, becomes activated and will present the antigen, like we learned in chapter 21, I believe. So in the process of being exposed to some of the pathogens, for example, the HIV virus will actually use these dendritic cells as a pathway to invade the body. So the HIV will be phagocytized by the dendritic cell, and since it's not just a regular cell that can be destroyed by, in a sense, breaking down its structure, since it's not a living cell, it's just basically a genetic package. So inside that cell, once those dendritic cells go off to alert the rest of the immune system that, hey, there's this new pathogen that's happened, well, that same time, that dendritic cell has become a HIV virus factory, and so as it's migrating around, it's also eventually going to release those new HIV viruses into the rest of the body, release into the local area to infect more cells and then continue that process. Okay, moving away from the lower region of the female reproductive system up to the breast. So For the most part, your breasts, unless they're active, are just a lot of fat tissue. So it's mounded tissue over your pectoralis major muscle, so in the chest. This area does enlarge in puberty. We'll go through those different stages later, but that's one event that happens during puberty is the increase in fat deposition in that area. The mammary glands that are inside of it, so this whole thing here is your mammary gland, and it actually develops only during pregnancy. So even though you have, you could have a little teenager who's of course not pregnant, but even if she has very large breasts, it's still mostly fat tissue. So this actually doesn't get activated until pregnancy, because you need it to feed the baby. So as long as the nipple is still getting the sensor information for suckling, it'll actually remain active, and so the mother will stay lactating throughout the feeding. So you have some mothers, they stop as soon as that kid gets teeth. Some mothers, they'll keep going until the kid's like 18 months or 2 years or however long they decide to continue breastfeeding. It'll still remain active. So once the mother ceases to nurse, so you're not getting that sensory information through the nipple that there is a suction on the nipple, and so therefore continue to make milk. Once that stops, then the mammary gland then atrophies and reduces in size. So that's why some women who, after they've had the baby, they've breasts have enlarged a little bit because of their mammary glands developing. And then, so the skin is stretched out a little bit. And so once the mammary gland atrophies, then it kind of might sag a little bit because you have this extra skin in that area. So that's why that happens. So there's two main regions in the breast. You have the body part, which is the conical part, where the nipple is the apex of it. So I'm going to zoom in for a second. So body of it here. And then the tail portion reaches into the armpit region. So this is why when they tell women to do their monthly breast self-check, they also tell them to make sure they feel around in the armpit region, because there's also a bunch of lymphatic vessels in that region where when there is breast cancer and it metastasizes, so it breaks apart and travels into other parts of the body, a lot of times they'll use those lymphatic vessels that are in that armpit, going towards the armpit region, to travel to other parts of the body. So that's why you check that region as well. And another thing, just with checking, a lot of times most of the lumps are actually found by the sexual partner. So that also is a good thing. Make sure, massage everywhere. That way, that's another person checking, making sure that you are completely healthy. Or at least just in that region. Okay. So, apex of the body of the breast is the nipple. So it has kind of circular colored zone, so it's darker in that area, called the areola. There's a lot of capillaries and nerves in that area as well, so it's very sensitive, but it also receives that sensory information from the suckling baby so that it can trigger the milk ejection reflex. So it's that sucking on that nipple that sends that sensory information to trigger the milk to be released. It also tells the mammary glands in whole to continue to produce milk. Not that one. Oops. Okay, there's what I want. Okay, so inside the mammary glands, the actual glands that produce the milk just itself are your acini glands. So that's this word here. So these are the actual ones that are, the glands are kind of like inside the mammary glands that will produce the milk. So as long as that sensory information from the suckling of the nipple continues to be sent, then those glands will continue to produce milk. Okay, so in order to have all the female reproductive system to actually develop, except for your mammary glands that again only develop during pregnancy, there's 3 major stages that happen in female puberty. So there's thelarch, which is that one, pubarch, and then on the next slide is menarche. So kind of a way to remember which stage is which. Thelarch is the development of the breast or boobs. Pubarch is the development of your pubic hair, axillary hair, so that's your armpit hair. So just focusing on pubic hair, at least get you in the hair region, different oil glands, your axillary glands, so the glands again inside your armpit region. So that's your pubes. And then the last one on the next page is menarche, where you have is the first menstrual cycle, so ooze. So thelarch, boobs, pubes, and then last one, menarche, on the next page is ooze. Kind of simple way to remember that. So thelarch, first one, first notable sign of puberty, fat deposition on the breast to make them larger. Also fibrous tissue to help with the structure. And then next stage, pubarch, so again, hair and different glands. Growing in either the pubic region or the armpit region, as well as stimulation of the libido or sex drive. That's that part there. Oh, perfect. And then last stage, your menarche, which is the first menstrual period. So in order to have the first menstrual period for a teenager, they need to have at least a body fat percentage of at least 17%. So with our improved nutrition of being able to better farm, being able to have better access to food, so therefore being fed well enough, the age of onset is actually dropped to an average of about 12 years of age. Sometimes it could be younger if the person has more fat. But the purpose is you have to have enough fat in the body to trigger that first menstrual period. So part of that needing a certain level of body fat is, you know, as our bodies develop through times of ice age and during times of famine, during ancient civilization times, you know, needing enough body fat to make sure that if we do get pregnant, then we'd still be able to carry and feed the baby throughout the whole entire pregnancy. So let's say someone, so an adult woman, it actually needs to stay at 22%. So starting off at 17, then of course going through the rest of puberty, starting having more fat deposition, and the number also increases to 22%. In order to maintain a consistently healthy level of consistent menstrual period, this is, you know, of course, barring abnormalities in hormonal fluctuations that can adjust the monthly schedule. But if the body fat drops below the 22% in an adult woman, so body fat, it signals the brain using leptin to tell the brain how much body fat there is. So with the communication with the brain, knowing that, okay, we've dropped below this certain percentage, then a lot of times menstruation will cease, so the woman will stop having her regularly monthly menstrual cycle. So if you're old enough to have seen this movie, G.I. Jane, so it's fairly old, Demi Moore played the main character. She was a Navy SEAL, the first Navy SEAL going through their level of training, and because of all the high activity, she burned so much fat that she dropped below that 22% and ended up stop having her period. So a lot of times it's either because they've become so active, or, you know, if there's an issue with actually getting enough food to maintain the fat level. So once menarche starts, the first few menstrual cycles are anovulatory, so there's no egg that's actually released. Eventually, kind of machine work starts to going, and about year after they start menstruating, then the ovulation starts happening at a regular monthly pace. Okay, so speaking of eggs, in the female reproductive system, the female is born with all of the eggs that they're going to produce or use throughout their lifetime. So it's unlike with the male reproductive system that can continuously make more and more sperm throughout the lifetime. For females, you have so many eggs, and then once they're gone, and you're no longer able to be fertilized and become pregnant. So the production of making of eggs is called oogenesis. So genesis, making of, and we're focusing on the oocyte. Our oocytes are still haploid, so they only have 23 single-stranded chromosomes. And again, this process is through meiosis. So during a normal menstrual cycle, so the normal monthly event, usually only one egg is released. Sometimes it's two, but usually it's only one. There's usually changes in the ovaries and uterus to go along with this, to either prepare for pregnancy, and if not, then releasing the unfertilized egg as well as the functional layer of the uterus through the monthly menstrual flow. Okay, so this, you saw a version of this for the male reproductive system. So meiosis having two phases. So you have your meiosis 1 and meiosis 2. This is all the same for meiosis 1, where you have one parent cell, the DNA is doubled, then going through your prophase, metaphase, anaphase, and telophase, finally branching off into two different bodies. So unlike in your male reproductive system where you split off into two different cells, for meiosis in the female reproductive system, one part that's branched off, and I'll show you a picture of it later, is what's called a polar body. So when that initial cell splits into two different packages, the cytoplasm is conserved for the cell that's going to eventually become the oocyte, because during the first stages after fertilization, the cell is going to go through multiple mitosis and splitting of the cell, but not becoming so large as in, making enough cytoplasm to be able to split too many times. So by conserving as much cytoplasm in the cell, allowing there to be enough cytoplasm, so when those first initial divisions happen, you have enough cytoplasm for the cells that are being made, and then those cells start growing larger, and so you start making more cytoplasm. Okay, so first polar body gets rid of one of those sets of chromosomes, so that's out the way. Again, most of the cytoplasm is in the daughter cell. So then the daughter cell starts going through meiosis 2, but it gets stuck at metaphase. So it depends on whether or not that cell becomes fertilized or is it not fertilized. So if it's not fertilized, then the oocyte is discarded during the monthly menstrual cycle. But if it's fertilized, then it will finish meiosis 2, undergo cytokinesis, and again, getting rid of a second polar body, so getting rid of those chromosomes. And so this time it's 23 single-stranded chromosomes compared to 23 double-stranded chromosomes, but still same concept. Getting rid of that excess DNA and conserving as much cytoplasm into the cell that will eventually start developing as the fetus. The leftover gamete initially only has 23 chromosomes, but those 23 single-stranded chromosomes will combine with the 23 single-stranded chromosomes of the sperm to make a normal 46 single-stranded chromosome cell. So again, 23 from each parent. Okay, so still focusing on meiosis, just a different way of looking at it. So here, where you have meiosis 1 completing, and then you go through cytokinesis, where you have your first polar body that is released off, so they separate, and it's just basically the nucleus from what would have been another gamete, possibly developing. Instead, just getting rid of that DNA, then leaving with your secondary oocyte that will start and go through meiosis 2, stopping at metaphase. So there we have our getting rid of the polar body there. Then going into meiosis 2, stopping at metaphase 2. So again, the larger one with the conserved cytoplasm. So it depends on whether or not it's fertilized. So if it's not fertilized, dies off, then discarded as part of the menstrual cycle. Never actually finishes meiosis. But if it is fertilized, then it completes meiosis 2, casts off a second polar body. So here we have the egg being fertilized by the sperm, casting off a second polar body, which is discarded or dies off. And then this 23, so our 1N and 23 1N from the sperm will combine to 2N, or the 46 single-stranded chromosomes, to form the zygote, which will eventually become the embryo. So that's it for our chapter 27. So you're almost done. Got one more chapter to finish up for AP2.